With the world watching what's happening in the Middle East now, Israel and Gaza, it's a very complicated topic. But with me is someone who's got incredible insight and personal firsthand experience. He spent many years, many times in the Middle East, formed very close relationships with presidents of some of those countries, and became a crucial asset to our presidents here in the United States as well. Joining me now is Dr. David Lesch. Good to have you here with us.
Pleasure to be here, Sarah.
Thank you for coming. You have some great local ties as well.
Yeah, well, I'm officially the Ewing Housel Distinguished Professor of Middle East History at Trinity University. Been there for 33 years. I can't believe it, almost to the day.
For you to get to that road, that is not how you intended to start from the get-go. I mean, I have a book here in front of me. I want to show this to everyone. But this is Dodgers to Damascus, and this is about your life. Because literally, as the title says, you went from baseball
Yes.
to Middle East history.
The natural road for academics, right? You know,
a bit of a detour.
Yeah, I was the #1 draft pick of the LA Dodgers in 1980 as a pitcher, and 2 years later, a rotator cuff injury ended what I'm sure would have been a great career in baseball. And I pivoted into another direction, academia and diplomacy and conflict resolution. And in that book, the wonderful author, accomplished author, Catherine Nixon Cook, wrote about my life.
Tell me a little bit about your road to getting into the Middle East history and how that happened, your transition from the baseball to that.
Yeah. Well, two things. I guess this was in the early 80s. And as usual, there's a lot of stuff going on in the Middle East. You had the Iran-Iraq War. You had the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. Shortly after the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty in 79, the Iranian Revolution in 79, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. I was interested in international affairs.
You have so much experience. I'm just going to mention a few of the things here, but you have your PhD in Middle East history from Harvard University, 17 books published on several Middle East topics, more than 140 publications overall, advised the White House in the last 5 U.S. presidential administrations. So Democrats and Republicans, both alike.
Yeah, and sometimes they actually take my advice. Rarely, but who knows?
Is this book available now? Can people buy it?
It came out yesterday.
Well, congratulations.
So you can go to Amazon or wherever you buy books and you can purchase it.
And I have the honor that you're here to actually tell us in person. You met with former Syrian President Bashar al-Assad on a regular basis, and you have formed a relationship with him as well.
I approached, through a good friend of mine who was in the Syrian cabinet at the time in 2004, the idea of writing a biography on former Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, because he was just in power, he had a very different background. So I went over to visit with him and interview him on many occasions. After the book came out, on the biography on him in 2005, at his request, he said, please come visit me, because in essence, I became an unofficial liaison between Washington and Damascus at a time when relations between the two countries were not very positive.
Israel and Gaza is really why I contacted you first, because the purpose of this interview was educational. And did you say you have been to Israel?
Oh, many times, yes.
Many times.
Yeah. The West Bank and Gaza.
And what was it like there from your experience?
As someone who grew up in the Judeo-Christian environment, it's one of the first things you notice when you drive around is like, oh my God, this is the Bible. All of these names from Megiddo or Armageddon, and Jericho and Bethlehem and Hebron and all of these things that you grow up learning. But I enjoy Israel. I have many, many friends. I've gone there and given a number of talks at their universities, have worked with Israeli professors, have met with a number of Israeli leaders over the years. I have disagreed with many of their policies over the years, but they've also, made great advancements economically, technologically, certainly militarily.
But in terms of the treatment of the people, the things that we hear, Gaza is often referred to as the world's largest open-air prison.
Yeah, or cesspool. In many ways, it's very different for Palestinians and even for Arab Israelis. When Israel became a state, there were Palestinians or Arabs who kind of got caught within the new Israeli state. And about a fifth of the Israeli population today are Arab. They're called Israeli Arabs. They're Palestinian, basically, who are citizens of the Israeli state. But you go to their towns, Nazareth and a couple other cities that are Arab-dominated, and they're just poor looking. They don't have the access to services that most Israelis have. And then unemployment is terribly high. The disruption of conflict on and off again.
When was the last time you were there?
Last time I was there was in the early 2000s in the Gaza Strip. In Israel, I was there a few years back.
What you witnessed discrimination, would you say? Because it is being referred to a lot of times as like an apartheid.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you go you go to Jerusalem and you see the wall that was built in the early 2000s by the Israelis as a security wall against Palestinian attacks. And you look at that and it's like, wow, and you see the other side. It's like two different images, a modern, Israeli side, and then much more poor Arab side on the other side of the wall. Now, in certain cases, there are just high fence with barbed wire, but that's just an image of, having grown up, with the Cold War, with the Berlin Wall. To me, it just resonated, and it was just you just get this sick feeling in your stomach that people are separated like this. Maybe as it's meant to do, it prevents any sort of interaction or cooperation, and of course makes life very, very difficult, particularly for the Palestinians. Movement between cities, going through checkpoints, it's not a good situation. And that's in the West Bank. The Gaza Strip is even worse.
There are so many people that I've spoken to in person, and I feel like this is probably a common belief around the country, that the conflict in Israel-Gaza right now started after October 2023, when in fact this goes back decades, more than 75 years. What do you make of what's happening now?
It's the lack of an agreement over 70, 80 years of a failure to come to an agreement overall on the Arab-Israeli conflict and certainly the Israeli-Palestinian situation. I mean, we can go back to the British in World War I.
And actually, I would like to do that. This used to be Palestine, and then it became Israel.
Right. Well, when I go to cocktail parties and so forth, and people say, they learn what I do, and they say, man, those guys, the Israelis and Arabs, or Israelis and Palestinians, they've been at it for thousands of years. And I go, no, not really. There have been moments during that history, but
they lived side by side.
Yeah, they lived
for a long
side by
time,
side.
peacefully.
Judaism and Christianity were considered protected religions in Islam, and when the Inquisition happened in Spain and Sephardic Jews were forced out, they went to Muslim countries to live. They didn't go to other Christian countries. And so, there's been a history of cooperation and living side by side. This started to change, and most especially with World War I. There had been some Jewish, or the Zionist movement began, which is a movement to bring Jews back to Palestine, what they consider to be their home, to Israel. The British, mostly, and the French, but mostly the British, entered into a number of secret agreements to carve the Middle East up after the Ottoman Empire presumably would lose, defeating the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East. So they promised the same land to all these different groups, including Palestine. One of those secret agreements particularly was important for the disposition of Palestine and Israel, and that was the Balfour Declaration of November 2nd, 1917, the establishment of a national home for the Jews in Palestine. Despite the fact that the British actually backed away from that commitment in the ensuing years, realizing, what have we done? We're upsetting the dominant population there of Arabs as well as Arabs elsewhere in the region. They backed away from it, but it did provide the legal framework for continued Jewish immigration into Palestine, and particularly grew by leaps and bounds after 1933 when Hitler came to power in Germany, and there was a tremendous amount of increase in Jewish immigration, particularly from Central Europe at the time. That's when disturbances started to happen because the indigenous Arab or Palestinian population started to say, what's going on here? When they were about 800,000 and the Jews in Palestine, were about 100,000, it was like, okay, they're in their areas, and there was actually cooperation, and there were factories where they were working together between World War I and World War II. 1947,
1948 is really when you started to see a massive exit of the Palestinians?
Yeah, the first Arab-Israeli war, 1947-49, Nakba for the Palestinians, the catastrophe. For Israel, it's the War of Independence. About 700,000, maybe half of the Palestinians that were in Palestine they left Palestine, became refugees in Jordan or Syria or Egypt, the Gaza Strip, going into refugee camps, created the Palestinian diaspora.
When you say they left, was that by choice or were they forced out?
Both. People have, studied this thing very closely, looking at Israeli government documents that have been declassified and released over the years. About half were forced out, a concerted effort by Israel to have a self-sufficient all-Jewish state because they thought the Arabs or Palestinians could be a fifth column within the country. And about half of those 700,000 who left, they left of their own accord just to get out of the way of the fighting.
So listening to you say that, that's very different, I feel like, what we've been taught here in the United States for decades. Here we're taught Israel is the promised land, a land for the Jews, and that the Palestinians were not meant to be there. They came with that area being conquered.
Yeah, I tend to be reflexively or convulsively against the idea of a chosen people. But if you believe it, that's their beliefs, and so you have to deal with that. This is also very important in terms of the evangelical or what is called the Christian Zionist movement in this country. And these are Christians that believe that the Parousia, or the second coming of Christ, will only be preceded if the land of Israel exists and is under Israeli control, and Jerusalem is united under Israeli control, etc. Many elements in Israel have taken advantage of that, particularly coincides in a place like Jerusalem that is, of course, so important to all three great Semitic religions, Islam, Christianity, and Judaism.
The Dome of the Rock.
The Dome of the Rock, the Western Wall, Wailing Wall for Jews, and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, they're all right there.
All right there. Yeah. Which is incredible because you have everybody coming together and worshiping in peace. But, and that's the case in a lot of places in the Middle East. You literally do see mosques right next to churches. There's synagogues. It's always sad to see all the fighting that's happening all these decades later. And most people just want to live in peace for the most part. But if I'm hearing you correctly, you were saying that when they were looking for a place for the Jewish people out of Europe, Palestine was not the only country being considered. Why did it settle on Palestine? Is it because of the promised land notion, or is it just because the British had more power in that specific area?
Both. Jerusalem is the center of Judaism. And so even Theodore Herzl said, we'll eventually get there. Now, the British, one of the reasons they issued the Balfour Declaration, which was a favorable, was a godsend, really, to the Zionist movement, was to get the support of world Jewry in World War I, particularly financial support from wealthy Jewish financiers, and also to get a people beholden to the British that could protect such a strategic area, because oil had just been really discovered there in the early 1900s, and the British Navy converted from coal to oil by 1908. The offloading of these pipelines from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean was in Haifa, in Palestine, or present-day Israel. And so it was very important for the British to have control of that territory and have a people, whether they be Arab or Jewish, beholden to them so that they would have supporters and, basically surrogates on the ground. They also wanted to protect the Suez Canal. Someone in the east flank of the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal, the most important British possession in the Middle East. It basically protected the lifeline to India, their most important colonial possession. So for all these strategic reasons.
So what it really goes back to is all these world powers just wanting a piece of the pie, the gas, the oil, an area that's rich with treasures.
Yeah. And there is, that's mostly it. I think, when you strip away all the stuff on the fluff on the outside, you go underneath that and you find strategic interests. But, there were British leaders in France who were, brought up in a Judeo-Christian environment and believed as well in the evangelical writings and literal readings of the Bible. And that kind of veered them in that direction anyway.
I want to explain a little bit more about how the immigration system in Israel works. Is it the only country in the world that is built solely on religion, in the sense that if you were Jewish, you can go and automatically become a citizen, regardless if you're American, Australian, South American, European, it doesn't matter?
Yeah, I mean, the twin pillars of the Zionist movement then, and even to a certain degree now, is immigration and land acquisition. At first, it was to get more land to house more immigrants coming into Palestine. Now, a lot of this was done because of the prejudice and anti-Semitic pogroms that were occurring in Europe, from Russia and Eastern Europe to Germany after 1933. And so there was a monumental effort to save them. And which is why, the founder of modern Zionism, Theodor Herzl, in the late 1800s, very early 1900s, he actually thought of maybe Argentina, where present-day Uganda, some of these locations to bring the Jews, because he said, let's save them first. Let's worry about Palestine later. But when Herzl died in 1904, those that in the World Zionist movement that wanted to focus on Palestine as the only location for a future state of Israel, they won out.
But we're talking about the settlements, the
Yeah.
settlers. You had the Palestinians living there in their homes. And to this day, you do hear a lot of Palestinians say, I'm wearing the key to my old home that I was kicked out from.
A lot of it has to do with property rights. The World Zionist Organization was well funded, and they bought a lot of abandoned land in Palestine, and land that had Palestinians on it that weren't registered on the land, because during Ottoman times they wanted to avoid conscription into the army and taxes. So they did not have, a legal right to be on the land. The Jewish community in Palestine, the Yishuv, it was called, they tended to have much more favorable terms with the West in gaining loans and investment.
How does someone from America, who's an American Jew or a British Jew or whatever, go and become an Israeli citizen? And where do they get all this land and the homes?
Well, this is one of the most controversial parts, is that, there are many evangelical groups in the United States that are encouraging immigration to Israel by American Jews, by European Jews, whoever. And because, again, it fits into their eschatological view of the end of times. And they help with funding. And many of these immigrants, they want them to go to the West Bank, to Jewish settlements in the West Bank, which really, according to Geneva Accords and UN resolutions, should not be there until there's a settlement on the issue. But Israel has, established these settlements. Some of them are rather large. And under the current government, the most far-right government in Israeli history, they've accelerated this pace.
Were there original homes there that were demolished and new settlements came up in place, or are these empty lands?
Yeah, well, both. I mean, both Palestinians have been forced out or compelled to leave as Jewish settlements are created, and also in just land that is fairly sparsely inhabited. But there are many incentives, especially under more right-wing Israeli governments in past decades, many incentives for Israelis themselves to move to the West Bank.
So like Jewish Americans or Jewish Europeans or
Sure,
Jewish
if they
Africans,
want, yeah.
they're given incentives to move to Israel, become Israeli citizens, and then live there. Correct? That's
Correct.
what you're saying. Okay.
Correct.
So a lot of these homes, though, are they just bulldozed over? People are kicked out, bulldozed over, and then these new settlements come in and they're giving to the new people who just moved into the space?
In some cases, unfortunately, yes. In other cases, these settlements are sometimes established right next to a Palestinian or Arab settlement, a town that had been there for a long time. And the tension between the two, the problems, a lot of times the Palestinians will leave or, be compelled to leave. Under this current government, which has kind of cast a blind eye toward aggressive Israeli settler activity, they've been very assertive in the West Bank. That's one of the things that people, everyone's been focusing on Gaza, and for understandable reasons over the last almost 2 years. And one of the things that that's been hidden by that is much more aggressive policies by this Israeli government in terms of expansion in the West Bank and turning the other way when Israeli settlers go on rampages and oftentimes ending in deaths of Palestinians. And of course, they fight back, or and it just gets this cycle of violence that helps the Israeli cause in that sense, because the Israeli army tends to side with and protect the Israeli settlers rather than the Palestinians.
I mean, when we look at maps, you see clearly, you could see Israel became more and more of a state, and the Palestinian areas decreased in these maps. So can you walk us through that time period and the PLO and then now Hamas?
I think the epicenter of all this is the 1967 Arab-Israeli War, when Israel defeated, again, combined armies led by your Egyptian guy, Gamal Abdel Nasser, which was a devastating defeat. Literature, film, art, everything changed in the Arab world after that defeat because Nasser was the hero. You know, he was the one that was going to defeat Israel. Arab nationalism was at its height. And yet when he took steps that heightened the tensions to a point where Israel launched a preemptive strike and defeated the combined Arab states in 6 days. And that's what made people like Osama bin Laden, who carried out, of course, founded al-Qaeda, carried out 9/11. That's what turned him and many others in the Arab world against the West, against Israel, and against these secularized Arab leaders like Nasser who failed.
When you say that's what turned them, so prior to that, there wasn't really the terrorist word as it is, now, radicalism.
Certainly Islamic militancy. Islamic extremism, and again, most Muslims are just peace-loving and fine and just want a better life. But as in any religion, you have extremists, and Islam has theirs. The Islamic, what many call fundamentalism or Islamism in the 20th century, took a much more virulent anti-Western tone, particularly because of the mandate system. The British and the French, the West was in your face on the ground now.
So it was born out of occupation.
It was born out of occupation by the West, by British, French, others, and then, of course, by Israel. Over the years, Hamas became the dominant element in the Gaza Strip.
Can you explain how Hamas was created?
Yeah, there's a lot of people will say that Israel created Hamas, and it's somewhat true, but in literal terms, it's not like they organized and funded the creation of Hamas. It was founded by Ahmed Yassin and it was as a branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, which began in Egypt in 1928. And it began as a social and charitable works organization during the first Intifada, Palestinian Intifada, which began in 1987 through 1988, 1989. However, I think it is fair to say that the Israelis nurtured Hamas and other Islamic organizations in the Gaza Strip, and they did so to counter the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization led by Yasser Arafat, which was deemed the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. That was a very secular and leftist organization. It was similar to what the U.S. mistakenly did in Afghanistan. We started to support the Mujahideen, the Islamic holy warriors, like Osama bin Laden's group, to fight the Soviets who had invaded and occupied Afghanistan in the 1980s, as well as their puppet Afghani government, left-wing puppet government. And so we supported these Islamist groups, these Mujahideen fighters, and of course it came back to bite us with 9/11.
The United Nations has kept records of the deaths and injuries of Palestinians and Israelis over the years. But just going back to before 2023, it's interesting to see the number of people who've been killed, including, the women and the men and children on both ends, but mainly on the Palestinian side, it's in the thousands, and that goes way back even before 2023. But the world, it seemed at the time, didn't seem as aware, I feel like, it was really Gaza and what's happening in Gaza now that kind of opened people's eyes to that whole area.
So this is the latest and most destructive of several Israeli-Hamas battles. There was one in 2008, 2009, one in 2012, one in 2014, and usually the casualties were about anywhere from 1,000 to 3,000 or 4,000 on the Palestinian side, and less than 100 on the Israeli side, soldiers and so forth. This current one is the worst yet, obviously. We really don't know because independent journalists aren't allowed into the Gaza Strip unless sanctioned by the Israeli government or the Israeli military. All there exist are Palestinian-based or Arab-based journalists.
Which has been a pressure point for Israel because journalists a lot of times are allowed to be embedded, during the Iraq War and Afghanistan. It's always been the case. And so for Israel not to allow journalists, international journalists into Gaza, and then the local ones, as we've been seeing reports of a lot of journalists being killed, a lot of the locals who have been spreading the word through social media. Why is it that they will not allow, you think, journalists inside Gaza, international journalists?
Sure, they want to control the narrative. I mean, this is what many governments do. Particularly, I'm not calling the Israeli government authoritarian in a true sense, but authoritarian governments tend to do that. They want to control the news. They want to control the narrative. Russia and the Ukraine, it's treason to report on anything other than positive things, positive from the Russian perspective, on the war in Ukraine.
But social media has really changed the game
Yes,
because
it has.
people were able to tell their own stories.
And that's really the only way we can get information in many cases. And the whole so-called Arab Spring in 2010, 2011, where democracy movements rose up throughout many countries in the Arab world, it was due to social media. And that really changed the nature of information flow in conflict areas.
There are two arguments you hear. On the Palestinian side, they say, we're just fighting back. This is our land. It's been occupied. We've been getting killed, discriminated against. We live in horrific conditions, and we are just fighting back. They don't see it as terrorist activity. On the Israeli side, they say Hamas are terrorists. They have to lay down their weapon, and they want to kill us.
I would say there's a lot of space for blame on Israel, on Hamas. A number of my Palestinian friends are, and most, quite frankly, probably most Palestinians in the area are anti-Hamas. Remember, there were anti-Hamas demonstrations in the Gaza Strip because Hamas initiated this attack on October 7th, horrific attack. It was terrible, killing 1,200 Israelis and getting 250 in brutal fashion, and 250 hostages. Now you can ask, well, what drives the people to do that? People don't normally do these things. Was it the systemic discrimination and repression over decades and decades? Yes, there was some specific reasons too. They wanted to disrupt what the Biden administration was working on, was normalization of relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia, which was very close. And so they want to disrupt that process because if all the Arab states are at peace with Israel, they don't have a chance. They have no leverage at all being by themselves. And so it was partly done to disrupt that process, but also I think in more longer term sense, a function of we have nothing to lose.
How does Hamas get through the most secure border in the world? The smallest thing triggers the alarms around there, and it's constantly filled with soldiers and being secured. How does Hamas do that and get so far out and get so many people and get back?
Complacency on the Israeli side. I think they thought that the Palestinians in Gaza were just going to stay there. I mean, Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister of Israel, the leader of this far right-wing government, since he's been in power for a number of years now, he's looked to manage the conflict, not resolve it. And so it really hasn't gotten anywhere. It hasn't moved forward, but it has moved backward, and certainly in terms of the Palestinian perspective. And I think the Israelis had this false sense of security that, everything was okay. This is the mistake they made then in '73 and the mistake the Israelis made today. They thought there's no way Egypt and Israel were going to launch a war in '73 because they knew they couldn't win. But they didn't launch the war to win. They launched it to improve their bargaining position. And so I think Hamas, in a way, was doing the same thing. They weren't looking to defeat Israel. They knew they weren't going to defeat Israel, but to disrupt things, as I said earlier, in terms of the potential normalization of Saudi-Israeli relations, and also just to upset the apple cart, get things moving. Maybe this will get people to focus on their situation. And oftentimes it's only in crisis that you get the attention of the global powers, of the White House. And then maybe people start to creatively think of ways to deal with this. But I think what no one anticipated was how far Israel would go in terms of wanting to totally get rid of Hamas. And now you have this post-October 7, 2023 mentality in Israel. The majority of the people in Israel still support this war. They don't, they don't support certain tactics. They want the hostages back, but the majority of people still support the war. This was like a Pearl Harbor to them. I mean, look at it, again, look at it from the Israeli perspective. If the equivalent people killed or taken hostage was if, let's say, some group in Mexico crossed over and killed about 66,000 Americans and took about 6,000 hostages. I think the U.S. would probably react very negatively.
Let me ask you this. Given that there have been thousands of Palestinians killed prior to 2023, If you make that argument for October 7th, then you're almost making the argument that it's okay what Hamas did because they were responding to what Israel had been doing
Right.
for decades.
Right.
And neither of them are right.
Right. And this is what has happened. You had this back and forth. We've come so close to have an overall Arab-Israeli peace agreement, including the Palestinian situation.
What is it going to take? What is it going to take?
Political will. Political will. The answers are there.
But what needs to happen in order for this, based on your experience, what are the Palestinians willing to accept and what are Israelis willing to accept to make peace happen?
Well, there still is barely, perhaps, a critical mass of people on both sides and in diplomatic circles that believe in the two-state solution. Israeli state living side by side with, in peace with the Palestinian state. There are a number of issues about what do we do with the Israeli settlers. How about Palestinian refugees? Do they have a right of return? What are the borders going to look like? What about what's going to happen with the share of water? What about Jerusalem? You know, because the Palestinians want East Jerusalem or some part of it as their capital. Now, there have been many creative answers to all of these issues, these what were once thought to be intractable issues. The answers are out there. I mean, we came close on several occasions. It's just, in my mind, what I have seen is political will on all sides. I mean, you have to have the Palestinian leader, the Israeli leader, the U.S. leader, and hopefully, you know, other countries in Europe all on the same page.
Do you think it's going to happen?
Eternally hopeful. It's going to take a lot. It usually takes a crisis like this. I was hopeful there, and maybe it will. Maybe it will eventually lead to something. But that's unfortunately usually what it takes. But I remain hopeful that at some point, everyone will get on the same page.
The United States' relationship with Israel, we have been their closest and strongest ally. How did that happen? Why is it that we are so close with Israel?
Many reasons. One, a shared Judeo-Christian heritage for most Americans with Israel, of course. Two, that many Americans, rightly or wrongly, but they see Israel as an island of democracy and a sea of tyranny. And so we want to naturally support, you know, democracies. Three, strategically, it's, of course, the strongest country in the Middle East. And the U.S. actually tried in the 50s and early 60s, tried to establish, you know, a surrogate power, a power that would represent U.S. interests in the Arab world. Egypt, in fact, we tried. It didn't work out. Saudi Arabia, we even tried. Iraq, we tried with the Baghdad Pact. None of those things work out because they fell victim to inter-Arab disputes. It fell victim to the Arab-Israeli conflict. We couldn't be on both sides. And these countries couldn't get close to the United States as long as we were close to Israel. It was really only after the '67 war that the special relationship with Israel and the United States began. The '67 war was fought mostly with British and French arms on the Israeli side. And so because of the superpower Cold War and the exigencies and the immediacy of getting, you know, pro-U.S. allies in a very, very important region of the world with all the oil and holy places and crossroads and so forth, Israel finally was determined, particularly in the Nixon administration, well, this is it. Israel and Iran, non-Arab, Iran under the Shah of Iran at the time, those would be, you know, our surrogates to represent U.S. interests. And U.S. interests at the time was to keep out communism and to restrict the Soviet Union in the region. And so we thought that our relationship and building up that relationship, and it seemed to work because Israel would consistently beat the Arab states and with U.S. arms and support.
And it's always interesting to see one election after the next. Every politician, when they come out campaigning, it's almost like in order for them to get elected, they have to come out and say, we support Israel.
Right. Yeah.
You don't hear any other country.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
They always come out and say, we support Israel. And that's one of the things they actually run on in order to be elected here in the United States to represent us.
And that's a function of the so-called Israeli lobby. They've done a great job. I mean, you just have to hand it to them. They have done a great job in gaining, congressional support and insinuating themselves in a position where they can make or break some, politicians and White Houses at times, because especially as elections have gotten so close in this country most of the time, getting the Jewish vote, so to speak, has been important because they tend to vote in much higher percentages than other ethnic or religious blocs, and so that's helped. But it's also hamstrung U.S. policy on occasion. On very few occasions, the U.S., when it's really important, they'll break with Israel, and they have done so on occasion, but usually not.
Not right now.
No, and one of the things is it's a disparate relationship because Arabs in the United States, they aren't really united. I mean, you don't have Arab nationalism to the extent in the United States. You have Palestinian, you have Lebanese, you have Syrian, you have Egyptian, Iraqi, and so they have different interests befitting their states back home. And so it's difficult for them to coalesce as well as the Jewish community has traditionally done in the United States over the years.
And when we say Arab states, it's because they speak Arabic. They just happen to have a common language
Right.
more than anything.
Exactly.
Thank you. Great conversation. I know we could talk a lot more about all of these pieces. They have many, many, many more routes that we could have spoken about. I'm going to have you here again, hopefully, for another episode.
Okay.
Thank
My
you.
pleasure.
I want to point out again your new book, Dodgers to Damascus.
Written by Catherine Nixon Cook. She's the author of the biography. Great
Fantastic.
author.
And you can buy this now on Amazon.
Correct.
And this is your biography and how you got started. Thank you for your time. Great information.
Thank you. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Take care.